Welcome, everyone. I'm Paul Willis from our English department here at Westmont, and I want to welcome the students, faculty, staff, and visitors to this reading by our visitor, Scott Cairns. I guess you should turn off your cell phones. Unless you want to just chime in to the reading in some way or another. We have Scott as our reader tonight, our only reader. So he'll read for about 40 minutes or so, and we'll leave 10 minutes or so for Q&A, and we'll make sure to finish by or before 8 o'clock. We have 3 of his titles out there, and Leslie Smith will be offering them for sale, and Scott will be happy to sign books after the reading. So let me tell you a few things about Scott Cairns by way of introduction. Just for somebody who slouches around writing poems, he's got a lot of degrees. He has a BA in English from Western Washington University, where his writing career started. He literally stumbled into a introductory creative writing class taught by Annie Dillard way back when, and then he got an MA in English writing from Hollins College, which I believe Annie directed you thither.
She got me in.
Yeah, okay. MFA in creative writing from Bowling Green State University, and a PhD from the University of Utah. So with all those degrees, it's just amazing he has anything fresh to write at all. But he does. He's also taught a lot of places, and you would think that would have done him in as well. So he's taught literature and writing at Bowling Green State, Kansas State, University of Utah, Westminster College, University of North Texas, Old Dominion University, and lest you think nobody wanted him for very long, he was at University of Missouri for 19 years as a distinguished professor. But just this last summer, he has retired, moved back to his home state of Washington, and now, as he'll tell you, lives in the home in which he grew up, just outside of Tacoma with his wife. Scott is back in Washington as a director of the Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing at Seattle Pacific University, and I'm sure he'll tell you more about that program if you are curious. Scott's published a lot of poems in a lot of places, many volumes of poems. He very often appears in an anthology called The Best American Spiritual Writing. I've appeared with him there a few times, but I can vouch that his writing was always more spiritual than mine. So we have 3 of his titles out there: Compass of Affection, New and Selected Poems, and more recently, Slow Pilgrim, the collected poems. Is that really every one of your poems, Scott?
Except for the ones that aren't in it.
Okay. Collected and neglected. All right. Endless Life, which are translations and adaptations of the Christian mystics. I think those are the 3 titles, and you can find many more titles online. I think that's as far as I'll go. He's won awards. He's a wonderful person. I just want to say more personally that Scott Cairns, as his name suggests, is of Scottish heritage, Cairns. But he tells me he has never been to Scotland. Instead, he has been to Greece a lot. in pursuit of the heritage of his firmly adopted Orthodox faith. But I want to say, Scott, that you are true to your Scottish surname, Cairns, and that your life as a person and a poet has marked a path for me and for many others. And the carefully piled stones of your many poems have shown me and others over the years how the felt truths of our lives may be earnestly and yet artistically expressed, sometimes with a layer of humor so thin or so thick as to escape our detection. And for that, I'm grateful. Please welcome Scott Cairns.
Well, I was hoping that Paul would, when he was riffing on my name, he would have said something like, "You rock." But he didn't do that. And those flyers that were up here, I was going to put those over.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm also in town to do a thing at, there's a liturgical arts festival, some of you might be interested in it, at Saint Athanasius. I think they say Saint Athanasius here, don't they? And it runs November 2 through 4, and I'm going to put that there if anyone's interested. I'm going to read you mostly some old poems, and then if there's a little time, I'm going to try out some new things, because these aren't in the collected. So my editor actually, he emailed me and said, "I want to do the complete poems," and I said, "Wow, that sounds... What are you thinking?" I'm over, huh? So I said, how's about we call it the collected poems? And he said, okay. So that's John Sweeney and Pericles, in case you're interested, in who wanted me done. Oh, perfect. That's great. Here's a poem that often makes people uncomfortable. So I'll say that I'll give you the title, and that is probably going to make you uncomfortable, and then I'll read the first line, and I hope you'll relax a slight bit. I should warn you, in my poems, maybe not this one isn't all that funny, but off and on I'll attempt humor in a poem, and I really do, and usually early in the poem. And you should take full advantage and laugh when you can, because those poems generally devolve into very serious matter. This one's called The Holy Ghost. Don't worry about it. Other figures would serve as well, so long as they too imply the sort of appalling stasis which still provokes unseen, albeit suspected, motion. A murmur caught in the throat. Hearts stammer. Vertigo. A windmill, now that's lucky, but only if the rope is secure, which holds the lead blade to the anchor, only if against the fiercest gale the blades cannot turn, though they tremble, though they threaten even to come crashing down or to be torn away, carried, perhaps spinning now and deadly to some murderous reunion with the earth. Well, that's a little theatrical, but you see what I mean. The issue is the flight one's mind provides, while influenced by that shuddering stillness, making itself what? Supposed? There were so many distractions along that narrow bay, so many nearly invisible coves you would not find unless your boat was slow enough to let you trace the seam. My fortune was the little coracle I had occasion to row across the inlet. In retrospect, the chore appears habitual, as if whole seasons had been measured by my pulling against my grip on the chirping oars, watching my wake's dissolution, its twin arms opening to a retreating shore. And true enough, I may have crossed that rolling gulf many times each day in fair weather. Still, I suspect this part I remember best happened only once. I am rowing steadily enough, davening across that bay, and reaching the choppy center, where I pause, ostensibly to rest, but the breeze also stops, and a calm settles upon those waters so suddenly I worry for my breath and can hardly take it in, and I am struck by a fear so complete it seems a pleasure. And I know if I were to look around, though I know better than to try, I would find the circle of shoreline gone, and myself adrift in an expanse of stillest waters. Well, it didn't last. A little air got in and I sucked it up, and the boat lifted, almost rocking across a passing swell. The shoreline was called back to its place, its familiar shape, and there were people on it, and I think a couple dogs, so I kept rowing, though I wouldn't remember until I'd docked the boat why I'd made the trip. It was an errand to call my brother back from swimming, which I did. Okay. Return directive. So, yeah, for those of you who write, I should admit now, I ran out of ideas when I was like 25. And so in order to keep writing, which I was obliged to do because by then I was looking for work, I developed the habit of reading. When it was time to write, I would begin by reading. And I've, over the years, developed a close affinity with a handful of poets whom, albeit dead, are my closest friends. And so we have these conversations, and I read them, they give to me. One such is, of course, Robert Frost. And so he has probably his best poem is, well, there are a lot of best poems. But Directive has got to be right up there amongst his best poems. And so this is my return directive. That's sort of a tip of the hat. And it has a line which opens his line, his poem. Back now, out of all this, now too much for us. The road there, if you take the road and not the shorter, crude diagonal that cuts across a ruined and trampled pasture land, is nearly winding as a spiral stair. Wind there neither flags nor any longer rages as a fabled wind might have done. The winding road grants progressive hidden groves where you might find standing still a profitable diversion from what journey you thought to take. And each of these may disclose a path or two, game trails, I think, but more than game might find some use in taking one. Such a path, I'm guessing, may never bring you back, but will demand another turn, in turn another choice, and you will choose and walk, choose and pause. If lost at all, you're lost to those behind you. To what's ahead, you're a kind of imminence. Besides, whatever loss or gain others measure, you will know what line you travel, and if you live and move, how far, how well you fare. Another guy I steal from regularly is Wallace Stevens. I think you'll hear a little Stevens in this one. Prospect of the Interior. A little daunting, these periodic incursions into what is, after all, merely suspected territory. One can determine nothing from the low and, I'm afraid, compromised perspective of the ship, save that the greenery is thick and that the shoreline is, in the insufficient light of morning and evening, frequently obscured by an unsettling layer of mist. If there are inhabitants, they've chosen not to show themselves. Either they fear us or they prefer ambush to open threat. We'd not approach the interior at all except for recurrent nagging doubts about the seaworthiness of our craft. So as a matter of course, necessity mothers us into taking stock of our provisions, setting out in trembling parties of one, trusting the current, the leaky coracle, the allocated oar. That's my favorite part, the allocated oar. And that's really bad form to mention that to an audience, but I really like allocated oar. I'm so happy when I found that. I do write prose poems on occasion when I get really lazy. And here's one. It's called City Under Construction. I think I got the idea. Do you guys know Italo Calvino's work? Yeah, one of my favorite prose writers, Italo. I wonder if he was a Calvinist.
Oh.
Okay, anyway, back to my poem. City under construction, and as I said, it's prose. As you might suppose, the work was endless. Even when at last the city stood gleaming like flame in the troubled radiance of that distended sun, we could not help but be drawn to where our next project would begin. The loosening bolt, flaking surfaces, another unnerving vibration in the yawning superstructure. We made a joke of it, the eternal city, and let our lives run out, reworking the old failures, refining our materials, updating techniques, but always playing catch-up to a construction that just wouldn't hold. Fretwork that wouldn't stay put, girders complaining under the accumulating matter of successive generations and an unrelenting wind. Granted, it could have been worse. At least the work served as an emblem of perpetual promise, as every flagging strut commenced another stretch of unquestioned purpose. Mornings when we rose from our beds eager and awake, thoroughly enjoyed our food and hurried out to work. Nor would it serve to slight the rich pathos we shared like a warming drink with co-workers, for here we'd be touching up the paint or turning the heavy wrench for the 100th time, and we'd smile, shake our heads, and theatrically say to each other how our city was insatiable. Just the same. This was not precisely what we had intended, that our city should grow into a self-perpetuating chore. Earlier, we had imagined, more or less naively, a different sort of progress, one with a splendid outcome. We fancied a final conclusion from which we would not be inclined to retreat. I recall how, long before we had so much as made a start, before we had cleared the first acre or drawn the first plan, we saw the city, and as near completion then as it would ever be. Infinite in the best sense. Its airy stone reaching to the very horizon, and I think this is the issue, extending invisibly past. At one point in one of my books, I have a series of what I call disciplinary treatises. They're kind of cranky theological poems. You'll only have to suffer through one of them. Disciplinary treatise number 2 is called The Embarrassment of Last Things. Already you smile.
I'm excited.
Drop your eyes and chew your cheek. Centuries of dire prophecy have taught us all to be well unconvinced. And there have been decades, entire scores of years when, to be frank, wholesale destruction didn't sound so bad, considering. You remember, we were all disappointed. That the world never ended meant we had to get out of bed after all, swallow another dose of stale breath with our coffee, scrape the grim ice from our windshields one more time on the way to work stuck in endless traffic. The radio or some incredibly sincere billboard would promise us again an end to this. And for a moment, we almost see it. But we know it's not an end. Not really. It's harder than that. Some kind of strenuous chore stretching out ahead, like these stalled cars, showing our general direction, inadvertently or not, mocking our pace. Well, cheer up, it's going to be... Oh, here's a pleasant one. It's called Mortuary Art. I used to run through the cemetery in Salt Lake City back when I had knees. I mean my own knees. Even the ancient open gate, whose hinges may as well be stone, whose purpose has always been purely ornamental, rests extravagantly at its protected terminus, black fleurs-de-lis topping a Byzantine blaze of black ironwork. Once inside, the live oak and ash-dappled expanse of gaudy statuary seems infinite, spreads as far as you can see and presumably farther. A great many winged forms, more or less angelic, some bearing human burdens, others extending arms in an open embrace, but all with the same expressionless faces of weary dock workers. Whichever narrow lane you choose, thanks, you'll find ahead a multitude of crosses, Latin mostly, but mingled with scores of Greek and Celtic, one or two, pate, botane, and down a lonely detour, the still dire flames of one startling spiny Maltese. Pausing before any one of these explains what time is for, lending whether it's circumstance, for dissolving whatever it happens across. All cemetery roads converge upon a center where, dwarfed and nearly obscured by outsized marble masonry and a high ring of ancient trees, so much like stone, lies a brackish pool like tar. Nothing lives in it. Its waters compose a grim accumulation of poisons laid out to keep the foreground neat, deceptively green, natural. Still, one is very likely to neglect the font, so easy it's become to slight what isn't blemished, and wander off, though the dust of the throat goes drier. From the shallows of that ruined pool, a copper tube, flanged at the lip and no thicker than your finger, blossoms out beyond its stem into something of a calyx, or white anemone, a wavering rush of water so pure you'll want to drink of it. One imagines that we need not confuse the fountain with its pool any more than we need pretend the gate, the angels, the scores of crosses partake in our little stroll among the dead, or suffer interest in our being here among them. In that cove, water from the font leaps up, its foam drawing light from some obscurity beyond the trees, inviting all who have come this far to proceed a little farther, to press their lips against the rising pulse, where all may drink or may withdraw. How's about this one? It's called Necropolitan. It's kind of a seasonal poem. We just had, not Thanksgiving, we just had Halloween. Necropolitan. I want you to notice that title because otherwise you'll miss the joke. So let's all say it together. Necropolitan. Not your ordinary ice cream. Though the glaze of these skeletal figures affects the disposition of those grinning candies one finds in Mexico, say at the start of November, though here each face is troublingly familiar, exhibits the style adopted just as one declines any further style. Nectar one sips, just as he draws his last dispassionate breath, becomes citizen of a less earnest electorate. One learns in that city finally how to enjoy a confection, even if a genuine taste for this circumstance is yet to be acquired, even if it is oneself whose sugars and oils now avail a composure which promises never to end nor to alter. Yeah, cheery work. See, that's why you have to laugh when you can, because soon you can't. Soon enough you can't. And here's one, and I'm not going to read because it's more dead stuff. But look it up if you get the book regarding the body. I would have read it. It's quite gorgeous. So I'm going to read instead some prose poems. And then another book, I had a bunch of poems called The Recovered Midrashim of Rabbi Sub. See, and they're prose poems. And dramatic monologues. You were teaching this in your class, dramatic monologues. I've often employed dramatic monologues to take the heat off me, to put the words into someone else's mouth, so that you can say, I didn't say it, he said it. But so I came up with Rabbi Sub, but then I thought I should give him a little biography, not just a name. So, regarding the sage whom tradition has come to identify as Rabbi Sub, very little is known, though a great deal is suspected. He was apparently a learned man whose devotion to the one whose name is not spoken did not preclude his speaking that name frequently, and more often than not accompanied by a tone of accusation. He himself has been accused of apostasy, blasphemy, manic depression, drunkenness, bad manners. He has been praised for his compassion, revered if not much liked for his eager upbraiding of the pious. While most forgive him his denunciations, few forgive him his glee. As to whether the emanation of the dual Torah extends to comprehend even these recovered commentaries, opinions vary. The first one is, I'm going to say the Lord's image. It's the Tetragrammaton, but I'm going to call it the Lord's image, in keeping with the tradition. I stole this brochure because we're putting together a brochure for the MFA program, and we were going to do a little trifold thing, and I thought, well, that's pretty old school. This is cool. So I'm taking this home with me, not because I'm fixing to come here in summer, though I may, but because I want to steal your artwork. The Lord's image. So you know what a Midrash is? You know what a Midrash is? Midrash. How many know what Midrashim are? That's a pretty narrow sample. So it's a biblical commentary of an imaginative sort. The rabbis, as you probably know, you know the Talmud. Have you seen a page of Talmud? How many hands can? That's better. That's better. So if you were to open a Talmud, there'd be a scriptural passage in the center of it. Then there'd be layers of commentary, and certain commentators have their certain spots on that page, but then others have been, come and go depending on the page. And then there's commentary on that passage. Then there's commentary on the commentary. And then there's a layer outside of that, and then there's even a column in many editions of citations for other books where they're commentating on that last layer. It goes on forever. So the power of the word is understood to be a living text that emanates and infuses even the things that touches it with life. And so the rabbis, when they were looking at a scriptural passage, they wouldn't look, as my pastors when I was a boy looked for ways to skip what they didn't understand. The rabbis would look for the things they didn't understand and imaginatively engage them, try to, in very often a narrative form, try to say what the thing was. It puzzles them. And, they're difficult passages. They call them dark sayings in the text. And so they would try to bring light to these dark sayings through their imaginative attention to the text. And so one particular genre of this rabbinic approach are the Midrashim. These are mine, and this is the Lord's image. After Genesis 1:26, when God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." In the Hebrew, that's really puzzling because the use of plural and singular is interesting. And the Lord sat in the dust, bone weary after days of strenuous making, during which he now and again would pause to consider the way things were shaping up. Time also would pause upon these strange durations. It would lean back on its haunches, close its marble eyes, appear to doze. But when the Lord himself finally sat in the dewy lawn, the first stage of his work all but finished, he took in a great breath laced with all lush odors of creation. It made him almost giddy. As he exhaled, a sigh and sweet mist spread out from him, settling over the earth. In that obscurity, the Lord sat for an appalling interval, so extreme that even time opened its eyes, and once, despite itself, let its tail twitch. Then the Lord lay back, running his hands over the damp grasses, and in deep contemplation reached into the soil, lifting great hands full of trembling clay to his lips, which parted to avail another breath. With this clay he began to coat his shins, cover his thighs, his chest. He continued this layering, and when he had been wholly interred, he parted the clay at his side and retreated from it, leaving the image of himself to wander in what remained of that early morning mist. And I bet you're wondering how sin happened. Well, I'm here to tell you. This is called the entrance of sin, and it jumps off of, the man said, the woman you put at my side, she gave me of the tree and I ate. Yes, there was a tree, and upon it, among the wax leaves, an order of fruit which hung plentifully, glazed with dew of a given morning, and there had been some talk off and on, nothing specific, about foregoing the inclination to eat of it. But sin had very little to do with this, or with any outright prohibition, for sin had made its entrance long before the serpent spoke, long before the woman and the man had set their teeth to the pale, stringy flesh, which was, it turns out, also quite without flavor. Rather, sin had come in the midst of an evening stroll, when the woman had reached to take the man's hand, and he withheld it. In this way, the beginning of our trouble came to the garden almost without notice. And in later days, as the man and the woman wandered idly about their paradises, they continued to enjoy the sensual pleasures of food and drink and spirited coupling, even as they sat marveling at the approach of evening and the more lush approach of sleep. They found within themselves a developing habit of resistance. One supposes that even then this new taste for turning away might have been overcome. But that is assuming that the two had found the result unpleasant. The beginning of loss was this: every time some manner of beauty was offered and declined, the subsequent isolation each conceived was irresistible. Yeah. A witness, thank you. And there's more like that. I'll read you a funny one, because you can't end with that one. I'm not ending. Don't get your hopes up. I got some more to say. Jonah's imprisonment. So, this is from Jonah. The word of the Lord, really funny guy, Jonah. Okay. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go at once to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim judgment upon it, for their wickedness has come before me. Jonah, however, started out to flee for Tarshish from the Lord's service. What might one then expect from when fleeing the Lord's imperative? Well, an obstacle of one or another sort. Uneasiness of mind, mixed connections, ungenerous companions, perhaps an enormous fish. That Jonah was without joy at the prospect of Nineveh is well recorded. Less famous is his disinclination for any intercourse with unbelievers, whom he, out of habit, identified as the unwashed. From birth, he'd been protected from most embarrassments: body odor, poorly cooked food, substandard grammar. And so the Lord in his compassion undertook to deliver Jonah from his own sin, not fastidiousness as such, only Jonah's insistence upon it. His time in the fish's belly was like death. At the very least, it smelled like death to Jonah. In retrospect, the experience fully imagined might still provoke a necessary sense of how the body, unadorned by ointments, oils, or silk, is little more than meat, mere meat for fishes. And if, in that confusion of digesting debris, Jonah chose to distinguish himself from other meat, he would have to come up with other criteria, and pretty soon. Consider any brute swimmer driving with all his energies against the tide. Notice how ineffectual and potentially comic the effort appears from the chalk-white cliffs above. Gross facts aside, the monster was Jonah's deliverance, a more than sufficient transportation to a more likely perspective from which Jonah was then fully willing to embrace anybody. I mentioned dramatic monologues. I'm going to give another one that's called, well, that can't be where it is. It's called the, what's it called? Oh, I skipped a whole bunch. I'm sorry. I'm going to read that one anyway because I've already set it up. It's way over here, though. It's called Possible Answers to Prayer. It's a dramatic monologue. You can figure that out, I'll bet. That your petitions, also, you got to laugh early on this one. On all of them, but especially on this one. And if you miss a joke, I'll stop and wait till you get it. For instance, this one. Your petitions, though they continue to bear just the one signature, have been duly recorded. Your anxieties, despite their constant, relatively narrow scope and inadvertent entertainment value, nonetheless serve to bring your person vividly to mind. Your repentance, all but obscured beneath a burgeoning yellow fog of frankly more conspicuous resentment, is sufficient. Your intermittent concern for the sick, the suffering, the needy poor is sometimes recognizable to me, if not to them. Your angers, your zeal, your lip-smackingly righteous indignation toward the many whose habits and sympathies offend you, these must burn away before you'll apprehend how near I am, with what fervor I adore. Precisely these, the several who rouse your passion. Now, I'm going to go back to the thing. I'm going to just skip those. I'm going to go to one of the newest ones in this book, and then I'm going to read a few of the newest. This is called The Fragile Surround. And I really have enjoyed getting back into the Northwest and its environs. And that pleasure has seeped into my poems. And these poems were written late for this last book, the Idiot Psalms book. The Fragile Surround. A veiling space in which we live and move, and chance to glimpse the trembling import of our late suspected being, and well, yes, the opening occasion of a guess that when we're after meaning, more is always likelier to please than the common taste of less, with which our eager suppositions are in the main rewarded. I'm thinking such lacunae as this cove may lend us all their latent agency, each and every time we enter, willing to attend the puzzle, leaning into ambiguity, aloof to any fear accompanying what bit we witness in the local, endless, fraught fragility of every passing scene. Keep up. I too had chance occasion once to lean, to choose between two such modes of travel, that of knowing clearly what I meant to see, and on the other hand, not so sure, but eager for the road's divergences to obtain to something skirting illumination. If I sigh now, it's not so much for me as for the prospect of a road constructed as we go, bearing both our burdens and ourselves, always just ahead and bearing on. And sure, we're hoping to proceed, to get somewhere, and much of our attention speeds ahead. My point, I now suppose, has more to do with honoring the road itself, the ragged, dust-glazed bracken by the side, and giving each attendant host its due, the roebuck, woodchuck, turtle, and the toad, the hawk, the raucous jay, or raven yammering, the fleet and near angelic wren and chickadee, the modest beetle, humble bee, blind ant. I love those critters. So anyway, I have a new book. It's called Anaphora. You can look it up. I'm being silly. Anaphora is, how many of we know, rhetorically, anaphora is a repetition. Like if you've ever heard, if you've read the Bible, Hebrew structures are very often anaphoric. And, therefore, certain orators of our modern era, Dr. Martin Luther King comes to mind as chief among them, who could make anaphora work pretty magically in stacking up those recurrences and then the modifications after the recurrences. So that's a poetic and rhetorical trick, structure. But another thing anaphora is it's that moment in the Eastern Church we have Eucharistic liturgy and the prayers over the hosts when the elements become the mysteries, what we call the mysteries. We call that the anaphora, but that is named after the prayer that the priest says, which is structurally an anaphora, initially written by St. James, the brother of Christ, modified by St. Basil the Great, and most often most Sundays, St. John Chrysostom's liturgy is the one we use, so it's his anaphora that gives that moment the name anaphora. So the idea being, it's when something mundane in the, not in a dismissive sense, but worldly becomes more. That's what I'm hoping for these poems. So I'm just going to read a couple at the end. I want to read another sort of celebration of coming back to the Northwest. It's the one from my dad, which you'll forgive me if I read it earlier today, but it's called Conifer Forest. So that's another aspect of the anaphora, the return, the recurrence. So my whole life is kind of in a recurrent mode. I'm coming back to a place where I was a young man, and now I'm a not so young man, trying to do many of the same things in a boat like I did have, and on the trails I then walked in. Conifer Forest. The date of this is January 27, 2018. More green than blue, more the color the sea adopts, just as the sun surrenders to the western edge. The looming conifer forest just now appears to hang beneath a tattered shroud, cloud resembling wood smoke. The resin in the air affords as well a scent akin to wood smoke hovering. Many years ago, I walked this very schist road with my dad, the two of us with rifles slung, muzzles to the ground, rifles we were unlikely ever to discharge. The mist was fresh upon my face, the mist thinning as we walked. Our going hunting was our way to make a day together, far from all that might have kept us moving far more apart. As I recall, we hardly spoke, but savored our slow ascent upon the road, breathing in the cool, obscuring mist, the cedar, fir, and hemlock. At one point or other, we found a likely stump atop a clear-cut slope. We settled there, dropping guns and packs, sharing coffee from Dad's red thermos cup. 30 years ago today, by all appearances, he left us all together. In my dreams, he visits still, walking with me on this schist road, offering again the sandwich, the steaming cup. I'm going to read one for Marcia because she once said, "What? All the other poets write poems for their wives and husbands and lovers, etc." And I love many things about Marcia. One thing I'm really grateful for is that she turns, the next year we're turning that year. We're both born in 1954, but she in April and I in November. So she kind of breaks in the new thing for me. So I get to see her wearing it for about 6 months and kind of get used to the idea. So she just turned 64. I will in about, pretty soon, huh, Paul? She asked if I still, it's called errato. By the way, I got fired from a job once for having an erotic poem in the Parish Review. It was called Interval with Errato. The place that now employs me was the place that fired me then. But I think that's just hilarious. But they didn't fire me so much as unhired me. They hired me to have a professorship, and then the poem came out, and then the then dean went to the then president and invented his outrage at my erotic poem, which admittedly had erotic elements, but it was mostly a funny poem. It was a very funny poem. It was Erato talking to. No, it was the guy talking to. It was she talking to him, and she was telling him how much she didn't like a lot of the other poets, but she really liked him. And she told him why she didn't like the other poets. So it was like an Ars Poetica where I got to let her say why other people where they failed. And it was, I thought, great fun, but they didn't. So anyway, off and on I've written poems. When I have written poems for Marcia, I've referred to her as Erato. This is Erato at 64. She asked if I still loved her, and I said, "Of course, I love you still." I watched to see if she believed, but all I saw was that she wanted very much to so believe. As for myself, I wanted very much to find a word to grant us both assurance, which is when I saw how words alone would not avail, that words alone cannot attain to evidence, cannot perform a proof. I pulled her to the bed. Together we addressed the matter of our love and made the most of what our words could not. I mean. Okay.